The scorched saucepan is already hidden in the oven. The doorbell is about to ring. After the Second World War, something remarkable happened to the American middle class. Returning soldiers and their young wives flooded into brand new suburbs, into houses with modern kitchens and living rooms designed for company. But these women arrived without the one thing their mothers and grandmothers had counted on: household help. The maids, the cooks, the parlor girls who had staffed even modest pre-war homes had moved on to factory wages and better opportunities. The new suburban hostess stood alone in her kitchen, and the blueprint for what to do next simply did not exist yet. Here is what I want you to hold on to for the next 30 minutes. The women we are talking about were not lucky. They were not wealthy. They were not working from some secret inheritance of fine china and unlimited time. They were working from almost nothing, and they were doing it while maintaining a composure so complete that their guests never once suspected the scramble happening behind the kitchen door. They were master illusionists, and the tricks they used were smarter, more deliberate, and more technically sophisticated than almost anyone gives them credit for today. Let us start with the money, because the money tells you everything. In the early 1950s, a typical American middle-class family was running their entire household on a weekly grocery budget of roughly $15 to $22. That is not a party budget. That is a survival budget. It covered breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a family of 4, plus cleaning supplies, personal items, and whatever staples needed restocking. The idea of carving a dinner party out of that number and making it look effortless is almost incomprehensible from where we sit today. And here is the part that gets overlooked when we romanticize these parties. That $15 to $22 was not just for the party. It was for everything. Monday's pot roast, Tuesday's soup from the leftover bones, Wednesday's sandwiches, Thursday's tuna noodle casserole, Friday's fish, and Saturday's whatever was left. The party had to live inside that same budget, competing with a family's entire week of meals. A hostess who wanted to entertain on Saturday night had been quietly making room in the budget since Monday morning, trimming here, substituting there, building toward a single evening that had to look like abundance. The mental math these women performed was genuinely impressive. They were not just planning a menu, they were engineering a week. If the party called for a beef dish on Saturday, she might buy a larger roast on Monday, serve it as the family dinner, and reserve the most presentable portion and the drippings for Saturday's company dish. A can of fruit cocktail bought for the children's lunches could quietly become the base of a gelatin mold for the party. Nothing was purchased without a second purpose in mind. The party was hidden inside the ordinary week, assembled piece by piece, invisible until Saturday evening, when it materialized on the table as if from thin air. By 1950, the pressure on the American hostess had become impossible to ignore, and one woman decided to name it. Emily Post, whose book Etiquette had been the definitive social Bible since 1922, sat down and completely overhauled her famous guide. The 1950 edition was a significant departure from everything that had come before, because for the first time, Post addressed the woman who had no cook, no maid, no help of any kind. She dedicated specific chapters to the middle-class hostess who was doing it all herself, and in doing so, she essentially rewrote the social contract for an entire generation of American women. Post called her the Mrs. 3-in-1. It was a phrase that captured something real and slightly exhausting about what the post-war hostess was being asked to do. She was the cook who had spent the afternoon in the kitchen. She was the waitress who would carry dishes from the kitchen to the table and clear them without fuss. And she was the gracious hostess who would float through the parlor during the cocktail hour, as if she had not just spent 4 hours on her feet over a hot stove. 3 roles, 1 woman, 1 evening, and the expectation that the seams between those roles would never show. To understand how radical this was, you have to understand what entertaining looked like before the war. Even in households that were not particularly wealthy, it was common to hire temporary help for a dinner party. A neighborhood girl might come in to wash dishes. A woman from the church might be paid a few dollars to serve the courses. The hostess's job was to plan, to greet, and to preside. The physical labor of cooking and serving was considered beneath the social role of the hostess. For Post to stand up in 1950 and say, "No, you will do all of it yourself, and you will do it gracefully," was a genuine cultural shift. What happened next was something that social historians find genuinely fascinating. The stigma of not having servants did not just fade, it inverted. By the mid-1950s, the woman who did everything herself, who cooked her own party food and served her own guests, and still managed to look poised and unhurried, was not seen as someone who could not afford help. She was seen as someone with extraordinary competence and grace. Doing it all yourself became the new mark of a skilled hostess. The standard had not lowered. It had simply changed its shape, and the new shape was considerably more demanding than the old one. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. There was a sequence to the evening that did not appear in any single etiquette book as a complete checklist. It lived instead in the accumulated knowledge passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, absorbed at the card parties and luncheons, where a young wife watched an older one and filed away every detail. The way the napkins were folded, the order in which guests were greeted at the door. The moment the hostess quietly disappeared to the kitchen, and the moment she reappeared without a hair out of place. It was choreography, and it was learned by watching. Picture a Tuesday morning in 1953. It is 6 o'clock. The house is quiet, the children are still asleep, and a woman is standing at her ironing board in the kitchen with a damp cloth and a hot iron, pressing a tablecloth she will not use for 4 more days. She is not doing this because she has nothing else to do. She has an enormous amount else to do. She is doing it because she knows, with absolute certainty, that a wrinkled tablecloth on Saturday night will undermine everything else she is about to spend 4 days building. The table is the foundation. The foundation has to be perfect. So she irons it on Tuesday, folds it carefully, and sets it aside. The tablecloth rule is one of those details that tells you everything about the era's values. Plastic tablecloths existed in the 1950s. They were available, they were cheap, and they would have made cleanup considerably easier. But they were not considered acceptable for an indoor dinner party, not even close. Plastic belonged on the picnic table in the backyard, not on the dining room table where company was seated. The distinction was not arbitrary. It was a statement about what the occasion deserved, and the occasion, no matter how modest the budget behind it, always deserved fabric. And this was not a rule that only applied to women with money. This is the part that matters. A woman who had almost nothing in her pantry, who was stretching a can of soup into a main course and praying the gelatin mold would release cleanly, still set her table with pressed linen and real china. She might have only one set of dishes, inherited or purchased one piece at a time. She might have pressed that tablecloth so many times the fabric had gone thin at the fold lines, but it was on the table, ironed flat, and it was cloth. The frugality was hidden in the kitchen. The table told a different story. The table communicated before a single guest sat down. It was the first thing a visitor saw when they moved from the parlor to the dining room, and it made a silent argument about the kind of woman who had said it. A pressed cloth said, "I planned for you." Real china said, "You are worth the good dishes." A folded napkin placed just so said, "I thought about where your hands would be." This was not vanity. It was hospitality made visible. The table was the hostess's opening statement, and she understood, even if she never articulated it in those words, that the statement had to be made before the food arrived. The napkins deserve a moment on their own. A cloth napkin in 1954 was not simply a practical item, it was a signal, and the way it was folded amplified that signal considerably. The bishop's hat fold, the fan fold, the simple rectangle standing upright in the water glass, each one communicated a slightly different register of formality. A hostess chose her fold the way she chose her centerpiece, deliberately, with the overall impression of the table in mind. And she matched her napkins to her tablecloth, or at minimum to the color story she was building across the whole room. The napkin was a tiny thing that carried a disproportionate amount of meaning. Now consider the invitation. We are not talking about a text message or a phone call, and we are not even talking about a casual card dropped in a neighbor's mailbox. For a standard living room cocktail party in the 1950s, formal invitations were mailed through the post. Handwritten or printed cards, addressed by hand, sent several days in advance, requesting the pleasure of your company on a specific evening at a specific hour. This was not reserved for milestone celebrations. This was the expected protocol for an ordinary Saturday night gathering. The formality of the invitation set the tone for everything that followed, including what the guests understood they were expected to wear. The formality did not stop at the invitation. Guests understood, without being told explicitly, that a mailed invitation to a home cocktail party meant formal or semi-formal attire. Women arrived in cocktail dresses, heels, and gloves. Men wore suits. This was not unusual or burdensome to them. It was simply what you did when someone had gone to the trouble of mailing you a card. The whole event was treated with the kind of reverence we might reserve today for a wedding or a milestone anniversary dinner. A Tuesday night in someone's living room in 1954 could carry more ceremonial weight than most occasions we mark today. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. The paper ephemera of the 1950s dinner party, the handwritten invitation lists, the penciled budget notes on the back of grocery receipts, the magazine recipes clipped and annotated in the margins, these were working documents. They were not considered keepsakes. They were thrown away when the party was over, or tucked into a kitchen drawer and eventually lost. But the ones that survive tell an extraordinary story about the intelligence and intentionality behind what looked, from the outside, like a casually elegant evening. Every number on those lists was a decision. Every crossed-out item was a substitution made under real financial pressure. Those annotated recipe cards are something I find genuinely moving. A woman would clip a recipe from a magazine, something that called for a pound of fresh crab or a bottle of white wine, and then she would sit down with her pencil and quietly engineer it into something she could actually afford. Fresh crab became canned tuna, dressed up with capers and a squeeze of lemon. The white wine became a splash of white wine vinegar and a pinch of sugar. The substitutions were not lazy. They were thoughtful, technically informed, and they worked. The dish that arrived at the table bore almost no resemblance to the budget that had produced it. Here is something that surprises people when they first hear it. When a 1950s hostess sat down to plan her party budget, she did not start with the food. She started with the drinks. The cocktail hour was not a preamble to the evening. It was the crown jewel, the first impression, the thing guests would remember when they drove home. And she funded it accordingly, sometimes at the direct expense of what went on the dinner table. Dorothy Draper, one of the era's most influential voices on home entertaining, put it plainly in her book, "Entertaining is Fun," and the line was quoted in women's magazines for years afterward. The first requisite for such a party is good liquor. The second is plenty of it. That was not a joke. That was a budget directive. A hostess who served watery drinks with a magnificent roast was considered a poor hostess. A hostess who served strong, generous drinks with a modest casserole was considered a triumph. The vessel mattered as much as what was inside it. A silver-plated ice bucket, the kind you could find at a thrift shop or a church rummage sale for $2 or $3, signaled something to every guest who walked through the door. It said, "This hostess has standards." It said, "You are somewhere that takes you seriously." The bucket itself cost almost nothing. What it communicated was priceless. This was the core logic of the entire 1950s entertaining aesthetic, and it ran through every object on that table. An hour before the guests arrived, the parlor was already finished. Not in the way a room is finished when someone straightens a pillow at the last minute. Finished deliberately. The ashtrays were positioned at precise intervals on the end tables. The flowers, whatever she could afford that week, were arranged in a low vase so guests could see each other across the room. The lamps were turned down. The record player was set. The room was a stage, and she had been its director all day. Lighting was not ambiance in the 1950s hostesses' vocabulary. It was a tool, as deliberate and purposeful as the tablecloth or the centerpiece. Etiquette and decorating guides of the era were explicit about this. Harsh overhead light was the enemy of a good party. It made food look flat, it made faces look tired, and it made a modest room look exactly as modest as it was. Dim, warm, lamp-based lighting did the opposite. It softened everything. It made the ordinary feel intimate. Think about what that means in practical terms. A 40-watt bulb and a fabric lampshade could do more for a 50-cent casserole than any garnish or serving dish. Under warm, low light, the colors deepened. The textures looked richer. The table looked like something out of a magazine. Women understood this intuitively, and the smarter ones used it ruthlessly. They were not hiding poverty. They were curating an experience. There is a meaningful difference, and the 1950s hostess knew exactly which one she was doing. If there was one single object that defined the budget hostess of the 1950s, it was the chafing dish. Not the oven, not the mixing bowl, the chafing dish. A polished copper or silver-plated vessel sitting over a small sterno flame. It was the technology that made the entire illusion possible. It kept food warm for hours without a second thought. It freed the hostess from the kitchen, and it transformed whatever was inside it into something that looked, by the mere fact of its presentation, expensive. Here is the magic trick in its most honest form. Take a cocktail wiener, a cheap, humble, utterly ordinary cocktail wiener. Drop it into a sauce made from grape jelly and yellow mustard, two ingredients that cost almost nothing and that every pantry already held. Place that mixture into a polished copper chafing dish over a sterno flame in the center of a beautifully lit parlor. Watch what happens. Guests gathered around it as if it were a crown roast. They asked for the recipe. They complimented the hostess on her wonderful hors d'oeuvres. The dish did not change. The context changed everything. The principle extended far beyond cocktail wieners. Ground beef meatballs, chicken livers wrapped in bacon, creamed mushrooms on toast rounds. Every one of these was an inexpensive ingredient that the right serving vessel elevated into something guests perceived as deliberate and sophisticated. The 1950s hostess understood something that modern food culture has largely forgotten. Presentation is not decoration. Presentation is communication. It tells your guests what to think about what they are eating before they have taken a single bite. The chafing dish solved a problem that had no other solution for the servantless hostess. Without hired help, she could not be in the kitchen and in the parlor at the same time. But she had to be in the parlor. That was the job. That was the whole point of the evening. So she cooked everything hours before the first guest arrived. The casserole went into the oven at 4. The appetizers were assembled by 5. By 6, when she heard the first car in the driveway, she was in the parlor, composed, unhurried, as if the food had simply arranged itself. The Pyrex casserole dish was the chafing dish's partner in this operation. Introduced to American kitchens in the 1940s and embraced fully by the 1950s homemaker, it could go from a hot oven directly to the dinner table without a second vessel. That mattered enormously. It meant the hostess did not have to transfer food at the last minute, which was exactly the kind of kitchen chaos that could crack the illusion of effortlessness. She lifted the lid at the table, The steam rose, and the guests leaned in. The Pyrex held the secret until the perfect moment. Picture her in the living room at 7 o'clock. She is laughing at something her neighbor's husband just said. Her hair is set. Her dress is unwrinkled. She is holding a glass and gesturing with her free hand, completely present, completely at ease. In the kitchen, the casserole is holding itself at exactly the right temperature in the chafing dish. The rolls are wrapped in a linen towel in a bread basket. The salad is plated and waiting in the refrigerator. She built this system so she could disappear into it. And it worked. Behind almost every elegant dish on a 1950s dinner party table, there was a small red and white can. Campbell's condensed soup, at roughly 15 cents a can in the early 1950s, was the secret infrastructure of the era's entertaining. It was the base of cream sauces. It was the binder in casseroles. It was the liquid in which cheaper cuts of meat were braised until they tasted like something far more expensive. The company understood its market perfectly. Campbell's published recipe booklets specifically designed for home entertaining, and hostesses collected them like cookbooks. And then there was gelatin. A 10-cent box of unflavored or flavored gelatin powder was, in the hands of a skilled 1950s hostess, something close to a miracle material. It could set into any shape a mold could hold. It could suspend almost any ingredient inside it. It could be tinted, layered, garnished, and unmolded onto a platter with a drama that made guests gasp. For a dime, a woman could produce a centerpiece that took up half the table and looked like it had required professional training. It had, just not the kind anyone gave her credit for. The gelatin mold has been laughed at for decades now. It shows up in vintage cookbooks as a punchline, a symbol of everything supposedly naive or misguided about 1950s food culture. But that reading misses the point entirely. The gelatin mold was not a quirky trend born from bad taste. It was a brilliant economic strategy born from genuine constraint. It was a technology for making scarcity invisible. When you understand what it was actually solving, it stops being funny and starts being impressive. Here is what the gelatin mold actually did for the budget-conscious hostess. She had perhaps 2 or 3 ounces of leftover roast beef or chicken from Sunday's dinner. Not enough to serve as a course, not enough to build a dish around, but suspended in a savory aspic with some celery and pimentos and poured into a decorative ring mold, those few ounces became the architectural centerpiece of the table. It stood 8 inches tall. It gleamed. It was served with a garnish of parsley and a small bowl of horseradish cream on the side. Nobody counted the meat. The sweet gelatin mold performed the same sleight of hand with fruit. In the early 1950s, fresh out-of-season fruit was expensive and often simply unavailable in the middle of winter. But a can of peach halves or mandarin orange segments, suspended in a bright orange or lime green gelatin, looked like abundance. It looked like luxury. Served unmolded onto a crystal cake stand and garnished with a spoonful of cream cheese thinned with a little milk, it looked like something a restaurant might charge for. It cost the hostess perhaps 35 cents total. The garnish was the great equalizer of the 1950s dinner table. When the main dish was modest, the garnish was magnificent. Paprika, dried or smoked, was dusted across the top of deviled eggs, potato salads, and cream soups with a precision that communicated care. Fresh parsley was arranged in sprigs around the base of every serving dish. Pimentos were sliced into thin strips and laid in geometric patterns across the tops of casseroles. Carved radishes appeared on relish trays. These were not decorations. They were arguments. They were the hostess making her case that this table deserved your full attention. The deviled egg is a good place to linger for a moment because it illustrates the principle so cleanly. Eggs were among the cheapest proteins available in the early 1950s. A dozen cost roughly 60 cents. A plate of deviled eggs, piped with a mixture of yolk, mustard, and mayonnaise, and then dusted with a careful pinch of paprika, cost perhaps 15 cents to produce. but placed on an oval deviled egg platter, which every well-equipped hostess owned, with a sprig of parsley tucked at each end. It read as something considered and accomplished. The paprika did not add flavor. It added intention. The Radish Rose deserves its own moment. A single bunch of radishes cost a nickel at most grocery stores in the early 1950s. With a sharp paring knife and perhaps 20 minutes of quiet work the night before the party, a hostess could carve each radish into a small rose, the red skin peeled back in 4 curved petals to reveal the white interior. Dropped into a bowl of ice water overnight, the petals opened further. Arranged on the relish tray the next evening beside olives and celery curls, they looked like something a caterer had delivered. They cost 5 cents. The skill cost her years of practice. At the center of nearly every 1950s cocktail hour spread, if you looked closely enough, you would find the same 2 ingredients doing the heavy lifting: a sleeve of Ritz crackers, which cost about 15 cents at the A&P, and a bowl of Hellmann's mayonnaise, which could be stretched into a dozen different preparations depending on what else was in the icebox. Mixed with a little onion powder and a spoonful of cream cheese, that mayonnaise became a dip. Piped onto a cracker with a sliver of pimento olive on top, it became a canapé. The box and the jar were the foundation, and everything built on top of them looked like it came from a much more expensive kitchen. The potluck hostess of the 1950s has been unfairly caricatured as someone who simply asked her neighbors to bring a dish and called it a day. The reality was far more calculated than that. A skilled hostess assigned contributions with surgical precision, directing one guest toward a salad, another toward a bread, and keeping the protein and the centerpiece dish entirely under her own control. She knew that if she left the assignments open-ended, she would end up with 3 green bean casseroles and no dessert. The table looked effortlessly abundant because she had engineered every inch of it the week before. One of the most persistent misconceptions about 1950s entertaining is the assumption that these women had generous budgets and simply chose to spend them on formal table settings and elaborate food. The historical record tells a very different story. With a weekly grocery budget of $15 to $22 covering every meal for the entire family, there was no separate entertainment fund sitting in a bank account. What these hostesses produced was not lavishness. It was a masterfully engineered illusion of lavishness, constructed from canned goods, careful timing, and an unshakable commitment to presentation. The abundance on that table was a feat of imagination as much as cooking. The food at a 1950s dinner party was intentional in a way that modern cooking culture rarely appreciates. Every single dish on that table solved a problem. The gelatin mold solved the problem of making a small amount of protein look like a generous centerpiece. The deviled egg solved the problem of stretching a dozen eggs into 30 individual bites. The chafing dish full of cocktail wieners solved the problem of keeping hot food hot while the hostess stayed in the parlor. None of it was accidental, and none of it was lazy. It was engineering dressed up in parsley and paprika, and it worked because the women behind it understood both the constraints and the craft. Picture the moment. A guest in a pearl necklace and a wool crepe dress sets down her cocktail glass, turns to the hostess, and says with complete sincerity that the pea salad is simply divine, that she must have the recipe. The hostess smiles, thanks her warmly, and says nothing about the fact that the entire dish came from a 10-cent can of Le peas, a spoonful of Hellmann's, and a handful of shredded cheddar she had left over from the children's lunches. The compliment was real. The ingredient list was invisible. That gap between the two was where the 1950s hostess lived and worked every single time she opened her front door. Every etiquette book of the era agreed on one point with remarkable unanimity. The hostess must never apologize, not for the roast that came out dry, not for the soufflé that collapsed in the oven, not for the rolls that burned on the bottom. Emily Post herself was explicit on this in her 1950 revision. An apology from the hostess, she wrote, drew every guest's attention to a flaw they might never have noticed, and it made everyone uncomfortable in the bargain. The mandatory illusion of effortlessness was not vanity. It was a form of generosity toward the guest, a decision to protect the evening from the hostess's own anxiety about whether it was good enough. The instruction to stay silent about kitchen disasters was not just a social nicety. It was a trained discipline that required real mental effort to execute in the moment. Imagine burning the bottom of your cream of mushroom sauce 5 minutes before the guests are due to arrive, scraping the good portion into a clean saucepan, adding a splash of cream, and walking into the parlor 30 seconds later with your hair in place and a genuine smile on your face. Etiquette guides of the era treated this kind of composure as a learnable skill, something a hostess developed through practice and intention, not something she either had or did not have. The parlor smile was not a mask. It was a decision. The scorched pan hidden in the oven was so universal a survival strategy that it became something of an unspoken joke among women of the era. You did not throw the pan in the trash because you could not afford to replace it. You did not leave it on the counter because a guest might wander into the kitchen. You slid it into the cold oven, closed the door, and dealt with it tomorrow morning. The oven, in the minutes before a party, functioned as a kind of emergency staging area, a place where burnt evidence, extra serving dishes, and anything else that would disrupt the illusion of the perfectly ordered kitchen could disappear until the guests had gone home and the parlor could finally exhale. Grace under pressure in the 1950s household was not a personality trait you were born with. It was a skill you practiced, the same way you practiced your pie crust or your card game. Women of the era read about it in Good Housekeeping and Better Homes and Gardens. They talked about it with their neighbors over coffee, and they watched each other at parties to see how it was done. A hostess who handled a spilled gravy boat or an uninvited extra guest with warmth and humor was admired the way a musician is admired for recovering from a missed note without missing a beat. The recovery was part of the performance, and the performance was the hospitality. There was an unspoken agreement that governed every 1950s dinner party, and it ran in both directions. The hostess agreed to leave her kitchen disasters, her budget anxieties, and her exhaustion entirely behind the kitchen door. And the guests agreed implicitly never to ask too many questions about how the food was made or what anything cost. What happened in the kitchen stayed in the kitchen. The parlor was a separate country with its own rules, and the moment the hostess crossed that threshold from the kitchen into the living room, she became a different person, unhurried, untroubled, and entirely present. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. Here is a misconception worth setting down carefully, because it flattens the lives of real women into a single corporate caricature. The popular image of 1950s entertaining is the husband's boss arriving for a stiff dinner while the wife performs for her husband's career advancement. That happened. It was real. But it was only one small corner of a much larger social world. Women of the era hosted elaborate luncheons, card parties, and afternoon teas for each other, independently of their husbands, as a way of maintaining the complex social networks that gave suburban life its texture and its meaning. These gatherings were not performances for men. They were how women took care of each other. The card party luncheon deserves its own chapter in the history of American social life because it was a remarkably sophisticated institution that has been almost entirely forgotten. A hostess would invite 6 to 12 women, serve a light midday meal with 2 or 3 carefully chosen dishes, and then move the group to card tables set up in the living room or dining room for an afternoon of bridge or canasta. The food was designed to be eaten quickly and cleanly, nothing that would drip on a good dress or leave fingers too greasy to handle cards. It was a social ritual with its own internal logic, its own etiquette, and its own quiet power. Early suburban life in post-war America was lonelier than the cheerful magazine photographs suggested. Families had moved away from their extended relatives, away from the neighborhoods where everyone knew each other, into brand new developments where the nearest neighbor might be a stranger from a completely different part of the country. The women who stayed home during the day while their husbands commuted to the city faced a particular kind of isolation that was rarely spoken about directly. Entertaining was one of the primary tools they used to fight it. A regular card party or a monthly luncheon rotation created a rhythm of connection that gave the week structure and the neighborhood a social heartbeat. Picture four women at a card table on a Wednesday afternoon in 1956. The hostess has set the table with a cloth she embroidered herself, and the score pad is tucked under the edge of a small vase with 3 carnations in it. She is dealing the second hand when she notices that the woman across from her has an empty coffee cup. She does not ask. She does not interrupt the deal. She simply rises, refills the cup from the percolator on the sideboard, sets it back down without a word, and resumes dealing as though nothing has happened. That small, unspoken act of attention was the whole art of the 1950s hostess distilled into a single gesture. The anticipatory hostess was a specific ideal that post-war etiquette books returned to again and again. The goal was not to respond to a guest's need after it was expressed, but to observe the room closely enough that the need never had to be expressed at all. An empty glass refilled before the guest noticed it was empty. A window opened before anyone mentioned feeling warm. A chair moved closer to the conversation before a guest on the edge of the group felt excluded. This kind of attentiveness required the hostess to split her attention constantly between her own participation in the evening and her quiet surveillance of everyone else's comfort. It was exhausting. It was also, in its way, a form of love. The centerpiece budget for a 1950s dinner party was often no more than 25 cents, which at the A&P in 1954 bought you a small bunch of grocery store carnations in whatever color was available that week. What the hostess did with those carnations was a matter of studied skill. She cut the stems at an angle, varied the heights deliberately, tucked in a few sprigs of whatever greenery she had in the yard, and placed the arrangement in a low bowl so it would not block conversation across the table. The result looked intentional because it was intentional. Flower arranging was not a hobby in the 1950s household. It was a competency, practiced and refined the same way pastry making was. Flower arranging in the post-war American home was taken seriously in a way that is difficult to convey to a modern audience. Women studied it from library books, from extension service pamphlets, and from articles in House Beautiful that broke down the principles of height, proportion, and color balance with the same rigor that a cooking column applied to a bechamel sauce. The rule of thumb was that the arrangement should be 1.5 times the height of the container, that odd numbers of blooms were more pleasing than even numbers, and that the colors should either harmonize with the table linens or provide a deliberate contrast. None of this was decoration for its own sake. It was visual communication about the kind of hostess you were. If the carnation arrangement was the centerpiece, the candle was the hostess's single most powerful and least expensive tool for transforming a room. A pair of white taper candles in simple brass holders cost pennies in the early 1950s, and what they did to a dining room table was nothing short of alchemy. They softened the light so that the tablecloth's worn patches disappeared. They made the glassware sparkle. They made faces look warmer and more animated. They made a $22 weekly grocery budget look like a dinner party that cost 10 times that. Every 1950s hostess understood this intuitively, which is why the candle was never optional. It was infrastructure. The moment when guests moved from the parlor to the dining table was one of the most carefully choreographed transitions of the entire evening. The hostess would excuse herself briefly, light the candles, check that the first course was in place, and then reappear in the living room doorway with a particular kind of unhurried calm that signaled, without announcement, that dinner was ready. Guests would set down their cocktail glasses, smooth their skirts, and follow her into the dining room, where the table by candlelight was waiting for them like a stage set that had been arranged specifically for this moment. The shift from the informal warmth of the cocktail hour to the formal beauty of the candlelit table was a deliberate emotional gear change, and it was one of the great pleasures of the 1950s dinner party. The seating arrangement was never left to chance or to the moment. The night before the party, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was quiet, the 1950s hostess would sit down with a piece of paper and work out exactly who would sit where and why. She thought about who would draw out the shy guest. She thought about which two people had a shared interest that would carry a conversation through the soup course. She thought about who should not be seated next to whom because of a tension that everyone pretended did not exist. The seating chart was a quiet act of social engineering, and it was one of the most skilled and least visible things a hostess did all evening. The night before the party, long after the dishes were done and the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pencil, writing out 6 names, place cards, even for 6 guests, even for women she had known for 15 years. This was not pretension. This was consideration made visible. It told each guest that she had been thought about before she ever walked through the door, that her comfort and her conversation had been arranged in advance, that she was not an afterthought but a planned-for presence. She did not write a recipe the night before a party. She wrote a timeline: canapés out at 7, soup at 7:45, main course plated by 8:15, dessert held until the table had settled into conversation, usually around 9, coffee with the dessert, never before, the graceful goodbye beginning around 10. This sequence lived in her head the way a conductor holds a score, every cue memorized, every transition managed without a single guest realizing there was a schedule at all. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. The dessert was never mentioned at the start of the evening. Never. You did not announce what was coming. You did not describe it when guests arrived. You did not hint at it during the soup course, and you absolutely did not apologize for it in advance. The dessert was a reveal, a small theatrical event saved for the moment when the table had relaxed into itself and the conversation had found its rhythm. That timing was everything. A Jell-O mold brought out too early was just a salad. Brought out at the right moment, it was an occasion. She had practiced the unmolding twice that afternoon. She knew exactly how long to dip the ring mold in warm water, how to run a thin knife around the edge, how to place the silver-plated tray over the top and flip it in one clean motion. When it came out perfectly at the table, jewel-bright cubes of fruit suspended in amber gelatin, standing 4 inches tall and trembling just slightly under the candlelight, the room reacted the way rooms react to something beautiful. A small collective exhale. Someone said, "Oh, how lovely." She smiled and said nothing about the 2 practice runs that afternoon. Historians who study post-war domestic culture tend to mark the mid to late 1950s as the genuine peak of this particular art form. The chafing dish had become a household staple. Pyrex had made the casserole portable and presentable. Gelatin technology had advanced to the point where home cooks could achieve shapes and layers that looked professionally catered. Campbell's Soup had published enough recipe pamphlets to fill a small library. Every tool a budget hostess needed to create an evening of real beauty was available, affordable, and socially celebrated. It was a brief, specific, unrepeatable moment. The shift, when it came in the late 1960s, did not arrive with a single dramatic moment. It arrived gradually, in small surrenders. Paper plates appeared at neighborhood gatherings, and nobody sent them home. Backyard grills replaced the dining room table as the center of summer socializing. The cocktail hour loosened into something less structured, less intentional. The formal invitation gave way to a phone call, then to nothing written at all. Each individual change seemed like a reasonable simplification. Together, they dismantled something that had taken decades to build and that nobody had thought to name until it was already gone. Plastic tablecloths became socially acceptable for indoor entertaining sometime in the early 1960s, and that single fact tells you nearly everything about the direction things were heading. The fabric rule had not been arbitrary. It had been a commitment, a declaration that this table, this evening, this gathering of people in this house mattered enough to warrant the ironing. When plastic replaced linen, it was not just a material swap. It was a philosophical one. Convenience had begun to outrank ceremony, and the dinner party as a form of serious domestic art began its long, quiet retreat. What was lost when the parlor stopped being the center of American social life is not easy to name in a single word. Part of it was the ritual itself, the sequence of invitation and preparation and presentation that gave an ordinary Tuesday evening a shape and a meaning. Part of it was the skill, the trained eye for a table, the practiced hand with a garnish, the memorized timeline. But perhaps the largest loss was something more intangible. The parlor had been a space where people were genuinely received, genuinely considered, genuinely hosted. When it went dark, something about the quality of attention we gave each other went with it. The invisible labor that disappeared along with the ritual is worth sitting with for a moment. The ironing at 6 in the morning, the timeline written out the night before, the practice unmolding, the garnishes carved from a 5-cent radish, the seating arrangement considered and reconsidered until every personality at the table had been placed where she would shine. None of this labor appeared in any guest's memory of the evening. It was designed not to. The hostess's greatest achievement was an evening that felt entirely effortless, which meant that every hour of effort she had put into it had worked exactly as intended. There is something these women understood about hospitality that a delivery app cannot replicate and that a restaurant meal cannot quite touch. Hospitality, in the 1950s sense of the word, was not about the food. It was about the preparation of a space specifically for another person's comfort and pleasure. It was about the 40-watt bulb chosen deliberately, the carnations arranged at exactly the right height, the place card written in careful cursive, the dessert held until the precise right moment. Takeout on a couch is nourishment. What these women made was something else entirely. It was welcome, made physical and placed on a table. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and she did it on almost nothing. That is not a sentimental observation. It is a precise and accurate one. She worked with $15 a week and a fabric tablecloth she had ironed before sunrise. She worked with a 10-cent box of gelatin and a copper dish she had polished the afternoon before. She worked with carnations from the grocery store and a candle from the 5 and dime. And she made, from those almost nothing ingredients, an evening that her guests remembered. That is not a small thing. That is a very large thing, done very quietly, by women history has mostly forgotten to name. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. The handwritten grocery lists with party items circled in pencil, the clipped magazine recipes with marginal notes in faded ink, the invitation cards tucked into the back of a recipe box, never thrown away because they felt too formal to discard, the tablecloths folded in cedar chests, the chafing dishes wrapped in newspaper in the back of estate sale boxes. These objects are not junk. They are primary sources. They are the paper and copper and linen record of an art form that was practiced with extraordinary seriousness by millions of American women and then quietly set aside, still warm. What I want you to take away from this evening we have spent together in that 1954 parlor is not nostalgia exactly, though nostalgia is not a dishonorable feeling. What I want you to take away is recognition. These women were not simply following social convention or keeping up appearances. They were practicing a genuine art form under genuine constraints, with intelligence and creativity and a kind of disciplined grace that deserves to be called exactly what it was: artistry. The 1950s hostess was a logistics manager, a visual designer, a social engineer, and a performer all at once in a pressed A-line dress with a scorched saucepan hidden in the oven and a smile that never wavered. If this evening in the forgotten parlor meant something to you, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me about a party your mother or grandmother threw. Tell me about a tablecloth you still have, or a recipe card you found in a box that nobody else wanted. Those stories matter here, and this community is exactly the right place for them. If you want to go deeper, I have a full guide to the 1950s gelatin mold linked in the description, because yes, we are going there next. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. The parlor is always open, and there is always something worth remembering waiting inside.